My name is Beatrice, and at 26 years old, I had resigned myself to a life in the shadows, a life where my greatest accomplishments would forever be attributed to a phantom. I never expected that my carefully constructed secret, the one that brought me both income and a private thrilling joy, would become the very thing that led the most brilliant man in England to my door. It was a secret I guarded with my life, for if it were ever revealed, it would have brought scandal down upon my family and ruin to my name. But as it turned out, the Duke of Davis was playing an entirely different game, one I never saw coming. Before I dive into this story of secrets, satire, and the delightful, terrifying experience of being truly seen for the first time, I want to hear from you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like the world saw only a fraction of who you really are, go ahead and hit that like button. For all the newcomers, please consider subscribing to join our community of storytellers and listeners. It truly means the world. My life was a study in contrasts, a meticulously balanced equation of public invisibility and private celebrity. To the glittering world of London society, I was Miss Beatrice Roberts, the plain, unassuming older sister of the incandescent Miss Cassandra Roberts. Where Cassandra was a confection of spun gold hair, eyes the color of a summer sky, and a laugh that charmed birds from the trees, I was quieter. My hair was a simple brown, my eyes a thoughtful gray, and my smile was a rare, hesitant thing, usually reserved for the pages of a book. In the grand ballrooms where my sister danced until dawn, I was the shadow that clung to the wall, a piece of forgotten furniture, notable only for my proximity to the sun that was Cassandra. Our mother, a woman who valued beauty and advantageous matches above all else, had long ago declared Cassandra her masterpiece, and me her a useful, sensible girl who would likely end up a companion to some wealthy dowager. I was the rough draft she'd had to produce before perfecting her art. But in the quiet solitude of my sparsely furnished room, under the flickering light of a tallow candle, I was someone else entirely. I was Justitia, and Justitia was the most infamous, celebrated, and feared author in the kingdom. For the past 3 years, under that fiercely protected pseudonym, I had published a series of satirical novels that held a mirror up to the very society that overlooked me. My books were merciless. I chronicled the absurdities of the marriage market in the gilded cage, mocked the preening peacocks of the aristocracy in the Duke's new feathers, and dissected the hollow pronouncements of society's so-called intellectuals in an echo in the hall. My prose was sharp, my wit was biting, and my observations were so uncannily accurate that whispers followed in my wake. Who was Justitia? Was she a bitter, exiled nobleman, a spurned lady of quality, a disgruntled servant with a photographic memory? The speculation was a parlor game in itself, and I savored every wild theory from my silent corner of the room, a faint secret smile playing on my lips. My anonymity was my shield and my sword. It allowed me to write with a freedom no woman, certainly no unmarried woman of my station, could ever afford. It allowed me to be my truest self, clever, analytical, and deeply unimpressed by the pomp and circumstance that so dazzled everyone else. My greatest and most terrifying admirer was Joseph Davies, the Duke of Davies. He was the exception to every rule I had so gleefully satirized. Where other dukes were concerned with bloodlines and horses, Davies was a scholar. He was a man whose handsome, severe face was more often seen bent over a dusty manuscript than a betting slip. He possessed a mind that was as sharp and formidable as my own pen. He spoke 5 languages, corresponded with philosophers across the continent, and his personal library was said to be one of the finest in all of Europe. He was also, unfortunately, the most sought-after bachelor in London, a fact that made him the unwilling centerpiece of the very world I mocked. And he, the brilliant, discerning Duke of Davies, was utterly captivated by Justitia. He wrote lengthy, laudatory reviews of my novels in the literary journals, praising Justitia's unflinching eye for hypocrisy and prose that cuts to the bone of truth. He hosted salons where the sole topic of discussion was the identity of this mysterious author. He saw in my carefully crafted words a mind that echoed his own, a fellow soul weary of the glittering emptiness of our world. To be so thoroughly understood by a man like him was a heady, terrifying thrill. It was also a disaster waiting to happen, because while the Duke of Davis admired the anonymous Justitia with an intellectual passion that bordered on obsession, he had met Beatrice Roberts on several occasions. And he had, to put it mildly, found her wanting. Or rather, he had found her sister so blindingly, mind-numbingly vapid, that I, by association, was rendered completely invisible. Their encounters were always the same. Our mother, smelling the intoxicating scent of a ducal coronet, would propel Cassandra into his path with the subtlety of a charging bull. Cassandra, bless her heart, would then proceed to talk about the weather, the latest fashions from Paris, the quality of the champagne, and the tediousness of having to make conversation. The Duke's eyes would glaze over, a mask of polite boredom settling over his sharp features. He would murmur a few pleasantries, offer a stiff bow, and make his escape at the earliest possible opportunity. During these excruciating exchanges, I would stand a few feet away, my designated post as Cassandra's chaperone, and watch the whole tragic comedy unfold. He never even glanced in my direction. To him, I was just the drab little sparrow that followed the bird of paradise. The irony was so painfully delicious, I could have written a whole chapter on it. I often did. The first crack in my perfect secret world appeared at the annual Blackwood Ball, a notoriously ostentatious affair that Justitia had eviscerated in her last novel. I stood near a potted palm, nursing a glass of lukewarm lemonade and watching Cassandra hold court. She was telling a story about a misbehaving lapdog, punctuating it with high-pitched giggles that made my teeth ache. The Duke of Davies was trapped in her orbit, his expression one of heroic endurance. I saw his gaze drift, sweeping over the crowd with a desperate, searching quality, as if he were scanning the room for an intellectual life raft. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second. There was no recognition, just a flicker of shared weariness, the silent communion of two people profoundly bored in the same room. Then he excused himself from Cassandra's circle, with an abruptness that was almost rude. He walked not towards the card rooms or the smoking terrace, but directly towards my shadowed alcove. My heart hammered against my ribs. He stopped a few feet away, not looking at me, but at the heaving, glittering mass of the ballroom. A veritable masterpiece of competitive consumption. Would you not agree, Miss Roberts? He murmured, his voice a low, resonant baritone that was startlingly close. He had never addressed me directly before. I wasn't even sure he knew my first name. My mind went blank. The witty, articulate Justitia fled, leaving the stammering, invisible Beatrice in her place. I suppose it is, Your Grace, I managed, my voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slightly, and for the first time he truly looked at me. His eyes were a deep, intelligent gray, and they seemed to see far more than I was comfortable with. My apologies, he said, a faint self-deprecating smile touching his lips. It is a failing of mine to assume everyone shares my cynicism. My compliments to your sister. She is luminous tonight, the word hung in the air, perfectly chosen, perfectly hollow. He was complimenting her appearance, a thing of surfaces, of light and reflection, with no mention of substance. Cassandra enjoys these events a great deal, I replied, finding a sliver of my footing. It was a neutral, safe statement. As do most, it seems, he said, his gaze returning to the crowd. It is a world that runs on the fuel of admiration. Tell me, do you believe a person's worth is truly determined by the number of people who find them charming? It was a philosophical question, a conversational gambit so out of place in this sea of frivolity that it felt like a test. It was a question Justitia would have relished. The temptation to answer as her, to unleash the torrent of observations I held inside, was immense. But I was Beatrice. Beatrice was quiet. Beatrice was dull. I believe it is a very loud and crowded way to live, Your Grace, I said carefully. It must be exhausting to be so admired. He turned to face me fully, now, a flicker of genuine interest in his eyes. Exhausting, he repeated, tasting the word. An astute observation. Most would say it is enviable. Perhaps they are one and the same, I ventured, emboldened by his attention. Perhaps the weight of so much envy becomes a burden in itself, a gilded cage, if you will. The moment I said it, I froze. A gilded cage. The title of my first novel. A flush of heat crept up my neck. It was a common enough phrase, wasn't it? It meant nothing. But the Duke's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A strange stillness came over him, a sudden, sharp focus that made the air between us crackle. A gilded cage, he said again, his voice softer now, laced with a new, unnerving curiosity. That is an evocative phrase, Miss Roberts. It puts me in mind of the author Justitia. Are you an admirer of her work? My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the precipice. One wrong word, one flicker of an eyelash, and my carefully constructed world would crumble. I had to lie. I had to become the most boring woman in London. I am afraid I do not have much time for novels, Your Grace, I said, my voice stiff and formal. My mother believes they fill a young lady's head with nonsense. It was a plausible, pathetic excuse, the kind of thing a dutiful, plain daughter would say. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a faint, familiar disappointment. He had cast a line, hoping for an interesting catch, and had reeled in another minnow. "Of course," he said, his tone once again polite and distant. "A sensible view. If you will excuse me, Miss Roberts." He gave a slight bow and retreated back into the crowd, leaving me shaking in the shadow of the palm. My secret was safe, but for the first time, keeping it felt less like a victory and more like a profound, aching loss. I had stood face to face with the one person who might understand the real me, and I had hidden her away. As I watched him disappear, a terrifying thought took root in my mind. The Duke of Davies was no longer just admiring Justitia from afar, he was looking for her, and he had, for one brief, heart-stopping moment, looked directly at me. The encounter at the Blackwood Ball left me deeply unsettled. For days I found it difficult to write. The voice of Justitia, usually so clear and commanding in my head, was now peppered with the Duke's low baritone, his thoughtful repetition of my words. A gilded cage, an astute observation. I would sit at my small writing desk, quill in hand, and find myself staring at the wall, reliving that brief, intense conversation. I had spent years honing my ability to be invisible, to be the silent observer in the corner, but the Duke's focused attention, however fleeting, had felt like a spotlight. It was both terrifying and, to my shame, intoxicating. I had dismissed his interest as a momentary aberration, a scholar's desperate attempt to find intelligent life in a social vacuum. I told myself he had already forgotten the plain Miss Roberts and her clumsy, accidental reference. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, my mother received an invitation to a literary salon at the home of Lady Danbury, a formidable dowager with a passion for intellectual sparring. It was the sort of event my sister Cassandra usually feigned a headache to avoid. "All those dusty old men talking about dusty old books," she would complain. "It gives me a frightful chill," but my mother was insistent. The Duke of Davies, she had heard through her intricate network of gossips, was to be the guest of honor, reading a selection from his latest translation of a Greek tragedy. "Cassandra, you will attend, and you will look interested," she commanded. "A duke who reads is still a duke, and Beatrice, you will accompany her. Try not to look so much like a frightened mouse." The salon was held in Lady Danbury's magnificent library, a room that made my book-loving heart ache with envy. Walls of mahogany shelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes, the air thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax. A small select group of London's literary set was gathered, a stark contrast to the usual ballroom crush, and there, by the grand fireplace, stood the Duke of Davies. He looked more at ease here than I had ever seen him, engaged in an animated discussion with a bewigged poet. When we were announced, his eyes found us immediately. He offered a polite nod to my mother and Cassandra, but his gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A shiver of apprehension went down my spine. The Duke's reading was, as expected, brilliant. He brought the ancient tragedy to life, his voice filling the silent room with passion and despair. Cassandra, seated beside me, managed to stifle her yawns with remarkable fortitude, her eyes fixed on the Duke with a look of pained concentration. I, on the other hand, was captivated. After the reading, as sherry and cakes were served, he made his way through the small crowd, accepting compliments with a detached grace. He spoke to my mother, charmed Lady Danbury, and then he was standing before us. "Miss Roberts," he said, his eyes on Cassandra, "I hope the reading was not too tedious for you." "Oh, not at all, Your Grace," Cassandra chirped, her voice a little too bright. "It was very dramatic, all that shouting in Greek." The Duke's smile was a masterpiece of restraint. "It was, in fact, English," he said gently, "a new translation." "Of course," Cassandra said, blushing furiously. "How silly of me. It just has that classic sound." I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. I could feel the Duke's intellectual disappointment like a physical force. To deflect from my sister's gaffe, I spoke without thinking. The choice to translate Ananke as inevitable fate rather than simply necessity was a powerful one, Your Grace. It lends a far greater sense of tragic grandeur to the hero's plight. Silence. Every head in our small circle turned to me. My mother looked horrified, Cassandra looked confused, and the Duke looked as if I had just solved a complex mathematical equation. The polite mask dropped, and the keen analytical intelligence I'd glimpsed at the ball was now directed at me with unnerving intensity. "You are familiar with the original Greek, Miss Beatrice?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of the condescension I expected. I have read some translations, I stammered, cursing my impulsive tongue. It is a passing interest. This was a dangerous line of conversation. My father, a scholar before his death, had insisted on educating me alongside my brother, a fact my mother did her best to conceal, believing it made me unmarriageable. A passing interest, he repeated, much as he had repeated a gilded cage. He was collecting data, I realized with a jolt of panic. He was filing away these little anomalies. Justitia made a similar point in her critique of Lord Ashworth's rather clumsy translation of the Odyssey. She argued that the soul of a work is often lost in the pursuit of literal accuracy. She believes, as you seem to, that the translator's duty is to the spirit, not just the word. He was baiting me. He was laying a trap, quoting the very thoughts I had published mere months ago, and attributing them to my own pseudonym. He was watching my face, my eyes, my hands, waiting for a sign, a flicker of recognition. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had to retreat, to build the walls of plain Beatrice back up, higher and stronger than before. That is a fascinating philosophy, Your Grace, I said, forcing a bland, pleasant smile onto my face, but far too complex for a simple mind like my own. I merely thought it sounded rather grand. I deliberately dumbed myself down, leaning into the role society had assigned me. I saw the flash of disappointment in his eyes again, but this time it was mixed with something else, frustration, and a sliver of doubt, not in me, but in his own dismissal of me. He had seen a glimpse of something, and I had snatched it away. Before he could press further, Cassandra, sensing the conversation had veered into territory she could not possibly navigate, saw her opportunity. "Oh, Beatrice is always reading some dull, dusty thing," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Mama says it will ruin her eyes. Your Grace, did you see the new filly at Tattersall's? They say she is a perfect specimen of Arabian bloodstock." The Duke's attention was forcibly diverted. The moment was broken. He offered a polite, non-committal response about the horse. But as Cassandra chattered on, his eyes kept flicking back to me. It was no longer a casual, sweeping gaze. It was targeted. It was questioning. He was a hunter who had stumbled upon an unexpected track in the snow, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he would not rest until he found its source. I had survived another encounter, but the game had changed. He was no longer just looking for Justitia. He was beginning to suspect he had already found her, hiding in the most unlikely of places. My carefully guarded anonymity was no longer a shield, it was a veil he was becoming determined to lift. The Duke's suspicion became a palpable presence in my life, a silent third party in every social interaction. He began to appear at events he would normally shun, afternoon teas, dreary musicals, even a flower show. His excuse was always plausible, an obligation to a friend, a duty to a family connection, but his trajectory was always the same. He would pay the necessary respects to the host, endure a few minutes of agonizingly banal conversation with Cassandra, and then somehow he would find me. He was never overt. His methods were subtle, a series of carefully calibrated tests disguised as casual conversation. He had ceased trying to trap me with direct references to Justitia. His new strategy was far more insidious, and far more effective. He began to present me with the raw material of my own novels. One afternoon, at a garden party, he cornered me near a trellised arch of roses, away from the main throng of guests. "Miss Beatrice," he began, his tone deceptively light, "I find myself in a philosophical quandary. Observe Lord and Lady Pomfrey." He gestured discreetly with his chin towards an elderly couple engaged in a heated, whispered argument over the quality of the miniature scones. "They have been married for 40 years. They cannot stand the sight of one another, and yet their union is considered a triumph, a pillar of society. What do you make of that? Is it a testament to the enduring power of commitment, or a monument to the art of mutual misery?" It was a classic Justitia-style observation. It was the central theme of a chapter I was currently writing for my next book, The Longest Winter. He was baiting me, asking for the very social commentary I specialized in. The urge to give him a sharp, polished answer, to lay bare the hypocrisy of the Pomfreys' marriage with the clinical precision of Justitia, was almost overwhelming. "I believe, Your Grace," I said, choosing my words with the care of a bomb disposal expert, "that perhaps they have simply been standing in the same room for so long they have forgotten where the door is." He laughed. It was not his polite social laugh, but a genuine, surprised bark of amusement. It was a startlingly pleasant sound. "Forgotten where the door is," he mused, his gray eyes crinkling at the corners. "A wonderfully pragmatic assessment. Justitia would say they barred it themselves and threw away the key for the sake of their children's inheritance. Then perhaps Justitia is more of a cynic than I am. I replied smoothly, my heart beating a little faster. It was a delicate dance, this conversational duel. I had to be intelligent enough to keep him engaged, but not so clever that I betrayed myself. I had to give him glimpses of the mind he sought, but always from behind the mask of plain, unassuming Beatrice. His most audacious move came a month later. A rumor had been circulating that the Roberts family was on the verge of financial ruin. A vicious piece of gossip started by a rival mother with a less beautiful but more richly dowered daughter. It wasn't true. My mother was far too shrewd for that, but it was persistent. I had of course used the rumor mill as a central plot device in my novel Whispers on the Wind. One evening at a reception, the Duke approached me while I was pretending to study a large, uninspired oil painting of a bowl of fruit. "Miss Beatrice," he said, his voice a low conspiracy beside my ear. "A fascinating, if cruel, social mechanism is at play tonight. Have you noticed how half the room looks at your family with pity, while the other half looks with a sort of triumphant glee?" "I have tried not to notice, Your Grace," I said quietly. "But you have," he pressed. "I see it in your eyes. You are not a woman who misses much. Tell me, if you were to write about it, what would you say is the purpose of such a rumor? Is it merely entertainment for the idle, or does it serve a more strategic function in the shifting alliances of society?" He was practically handing me a quill and asking me to draft a chapter. He was testing my analytical skills, my ability to dissect the very social machinations that were my stock in trade. He watched me, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were trying to read the manuscript of my soul. This was his game, to draw Justitia out of Beatrice, to make the mask slip. My own game was to keep them separate, to prove that the insightful mind could belong to anyone, that it was not the exclusive property of his phantom author. "I think, Your Grace," I began slowly, "that a rumor is a currency. For some, spending it buys a moment of feeling superior. For others, it is an investment, hoping to devalue a rival's stock. But like all currencies not backed by the gold of truth, it is ultimately worthless." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. I held his gaze, my expression deliberately placid, my hands clasped tightly in front of me to stop their trembling. I had given him a good answer, a clever answer, but it was a Beatrice answer, thoughtful, measured, and slightly melancholic. A Justitia answer would have been sharper, more cynical, probably involving a metaphor about vultures circling a wounded deer. "An elegant analogy, Miss Roberts," he finally said, though a flicker of something, disappointment, confusion, crossed his face. "You have a remarkable mind." He said it, not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact, an observation he was adding to his growing collection of evidence. The pressure was becoming immense. I felt like a spy undergoing a relentless interrogation. His constant probing attention was both a threat and a strange sort of validation. He was the only person in the world who was actively looking for the real me, even if he didn't know it. The strain of maintaining my dual identity was beginning to wear me down. I found myself making small, careless slips, using a turn of phrase in conversation that I had used in a novel, displaying a knowledge of politics or finance that a sheltered young woman like myself was not supposed to possess. Each time, I would see that flicker of intense focus in his eyes, and I would feel the net drawing tighter. The breaking point arrived in the form of an invitation. The Duke of Davis requested the pleasure of Mrs. Roberts and her daughter's company for a weekend party at his country estate, Davis Park. My mother was ecstatic, convinced this was the prelude to a proposal for Cassandra. Cassandra was thrilled at the prospect of a ducal house party. I was filled with a cold, creeping dread. A ballroom or a salon offered crowds to hide in, distractions to be deployed. A weekend at his private estate was a different matter entirely. It would be a small, curated group of guests. There would be no escape from his scrutiny. It was no longer a game of chance encounters in a crowded city. He was moving me to his own chessboard, a board where he controlled all the pieces. I knew with a terrifying certainty that this weekend would be the final act. He was done with tests and probes. He was going for checkmate. The drive to Davies Park was a masterclass in my mother's tactical optimism and my own quiet terror. She chattered relentlessly about the Davies lineage, the size of the estate, and the precise shade of blue Cassandra should wear to best complement the ducal crest. Cassandra, for her part, practiced looking serenely regal, a look that mostly made her appear constipated. I sat in silence, twisting my gloves in my lap, feeling like a prisoner on my way to sentencing. The estate, when we finally arrived, was breathtaking. It wasn't a gaudy palace, but a masterpiece of Palladian architecture, a house that spoke of quiet, generational intelligence rather than ostentatious wealth. It was a house a man like Joseph Davies would own. It was a house Justicia would appreciate. The other guests were a small, formidable collection of the Duke's closest acquaintances, a sharp-witted politician, a celebrated female astronomer, and an elderly professor who had been the Duke's tutor at Oxford. There was no fluff, it was a gathering of minds, and my mother's immediate panic was a joy to behold. She had coached Cassandra on how to discuss horses and fashion, not Copernican theory. My sister was a beautiful, exotic bird suddenly caged with a flock of intimidatingly clever ravens. I, on the other hand, felt a pang of longing. This was a world I could thrive in, if only I were not forced to play the fool. The Duke was a gracious host, but I could feel his attention on me from the moment we arrived. It was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of conversation. He seated me next to the elderly professor at dinner on the first night, a deliberately strategic move. The professor, a kindly man named Mr. Davies, immediately engaged me in a discussion about Roman history, a topic on which I was surprisingly well-versed, thanks to my father's library. I tried to demur, to be the simple Miss Roberts, but the professor's enthusiasm was infectious, and I soon found myself debating the economic factors of the late Republic with a passion I had forgotten I possessed. Across the polished mahogany table, I saw the Duke watching, his fork paused halfway to his mouth, a look of intense, triumphant concentration on his face. He wasn't listening to the politician on his right, he was listening to me. He had placed the bait, and I had taken it. The next day, he orchestrated his masterstroke. After a walk through the grounds, he led a small group of us, including myself and a bewildered Cassandra, into his library. If Lady Danbury's library had made my heart ache, this one stopped it completely. It was 2 stories high, with a gallery running along the upper level, and every inch of wall space was covered in books. The air smelled of knowledge itself. It was my personal heaven. I have recently acquired a rather interesting curiosity, the Duke announced, leading us to a glass display case. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a letter. The handwriting was neat and precise. It was my handwriting. My blood turned to ice water. I felt faint. "This," he said, his voice calm and measured, "is a letter purported to be from the author Justicia, sold to me by a rather unscrupulous dealer. It is addressed to her publisher, discussing several key plot points for her next novel." He looked around the small group, his eyes finally settling on me. The dealer swore to its authenticity. However, I have my doubts. The prose feels lacking. The wit seems forced. I suspect it is a clever forgery. He was lying. The letter was real. I remembered writing it. It was one of several I had sent to my publisher via a clandestine system of couriers. One must have been intercepted, sold to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder was now using it as the centerpiece of his trap. "What I find most fascinating," he continued, his gaze still locked on mine, "is the plot it outlines. A story about a plain, overlooked sister in a prominent family who secretly writes scandalous novels, using her position as an invisible observer to gather material." He let the words hang in the silent room. Cassandra gasped. The politician raised an eyebrow. My own heart felt as though it would beat its way out of my chest. "A rather fanciful plot, don't you think, Miss Beatrice?" he asked, his voice soft as silk and sharp as a razor. "Do you think such a thing is plausible, that a woman could lead such an extraordinary double life, right under the nose of society?" The entire room was looking at me. Cassandra stared, her mouth agape, a dawning, horrified comprehension in her eyes. My mother, who had followed us in, looked like she might faint. This was it, the checkmate I had dreaded. He had laid all the pieces out, my accidental quotes, my knowledge of Greek, my debates on history, and now this, the very plot of my own life, laid bare in my own handwriting. He had cornered me. There were no more shadows to hide in. He hadn't just lifted the veil, he had ripped it away in front of an audience. He was not asking a question, he was making a demand for the truth. And in the magnificent, suffocating silence of his library, I had to decide whether to give it to him. The silence in the library was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on my shoulders and stole the air from my lungs. Every eye was on me. The politician's gaze was shrewd and calculating, the astronomer's was wide with curiosity, and Cassandra's was a maelstrom of confusion and betrayal. My mother's face had paled to a sickly white, but the only gaze that mattered was the Duke's. It was not triumphant or smug, it was intense, searching, and filled with a terrifying, hopeful vulnerability. He was not prosecuting a criminal. He was petitioning a queen. He had built his case, laid out his evidence, and was now awaiting the verdict, a verdict only I could deliver. In that moment, a strange calm washed over me. The fear that had been my constant companion for 3 years, the frantic, terrified scrambling to protect my secret, simply evaporated. What was I so afraid of? Scandal? My family's disapproval? I had lived with their disapproval my entire life, being ostracized by a society I secretly held in contempt. The terror of being exposed was nothing compared to the slow, creeping death of being invisible. He had seen me. Joseph Davies had looked past the plain face, the quiet demeanor, the drab dresses, and he had seen the mind and the soul I had kept hidden from the world. He had not stumbled upon my secret by accident. He had pursued it methodically, relentlessly, brilliantly. He had hunted for Justicia not to expose her, but to know her. I took a deep breath, the scent of old leather and paper filling my senses, grounding me. I looked away from the Duke and met my sister's wide, shocked eyes. I saw the hurt there, the bewilderment of realizing the sister she thought she knew, the one she had so casually dismissed, was a complete stranger. Then I looked at my mother, whose expression was already calculating the social fallout, the damage to Cassandra's prospects. There was no concern for me, only for the family's reputation, and in that moment their opinions ceased to matter. The only opinion that mattered was my own. I turned back to the Duke. I did not raise my voice. I did not weep or confess in a torrent of emotion. I answered him with the same quiet dignity he had used to question me. "Plausible, Your Grace?" I said, my voice clear and steady, resonating in the hushed room. "I would say it is not only plausible, but in some cases necessary." I walked the few steps to the display case, my gaze never leaving his. When a woman is born with a mind society tells her not to use, and a voice society tells her to keep quiet, she must find another way to speak. When she is told her only value lies in a pretty face or a fertile womb, she must create her own value. She builds a fortress of silence and anonymity, not to hide, but to survive, to work, to be. I gently placed my hand on the glass case, directly over my own handwriting. This letter is not a forgery. It is, however, a violation of my privacy. I looked up at him, and for the first time I let him see all of it. Not the shy Beatrice, not the sharp Justicia, but the woman who was both. The plot you describe is not fanciful. It is my life. My name is Beatrice Roberts, and I am the author you call Justicia. A collective gasp went through the room. My mother made a small, strangled noise. Cassandra just stared, tears welling in her eyes. The Duke did not move. He did not even seem to be breathing. He just watched me, his face a mask of profound, unreadable emotion. "I did not write to cause scandal," I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I wrote because I had to. I wrote to make sense of a world that seemed nonsensical. I wrote to give voice to the frustrations and observations that so many feel but dare not speak. I wrote because the words were a fire in my blood, and to keep them in would have burned me to ash." I looked around at the small audience, and I hid, because I knew. I knew that the world would not celebrate a woman for her wit. They would condemn her for her sharpness. They would call her a shrew, a spinster, a bitter, unnatural creature. Justicia could be praised. Beatrice Roberts would have been destroyed. Finally, I turned my full attention back to the Duke. "You, Your Grace, have put me in an impossible position. You have pursued my secret with the single-minded focus of a scholar, and you have unmasked me. The question now is why?" The room held its breath. The Duke's carefully constructed composure finally broke. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face. A smile of pure, unadulterated relief and wonder. He stepped forward, closing the space between us until he was standing right before me. He did not seem to notice anyone else in the room. "Why?" he repeated, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Because for 3 years I have been in conversation with the most brilliant, incisive, and courageous mind in England. I have read your words and felt less alone in the world. I found a spirit that echoed my own, a cynicism tempered with a deep, albeit hidden sense of justice. I had to know the person who possessed such a mind. I had to see if the soul behind the words was as extraordinary as the words themselves." He reached out, not to touch me, but as if to gesture at the entirety of my being. "I looked for you in every salon, every ballroom. I listened for your voice in every inane conversation, and I found nothing. Nothing but glimpses. A phrase here, an observation there, a flash of startling intelligence from the one person everyone, myself included, was trained to overlook. His gaze was filled with a remorseful honesty. I confess, my methods have been unorthodox. This was a desperate gambit. But I had to know. I had to see if the woman I so admired from afar was the same woman who was beginning to captivate me up close. He lowered his voice so that only I could hear. Beatrice, I did not seek to expose you. I sought to find you. And now that I have, I find you are more magnificent than I ever could have imagined. In that moment, the world narrowed to the space of a single breath between us. The scandal, my mother's fury, Cassandra's tears, it all faded into a distant hum. He hadn't unmasked me to shame me. He had unmasked me to praise me, to see me. All of me, the plain sister, the secret author, the quiet observer, the fierce mind. It was a vindication so profound, so complete, that it left me breathless. A single happy tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek. The cat was out of the bag, the game was over, and in its place was the beginning of something far more terrifying and far more wonderful. The immediate aftermath was chaos, albeit a very well-bred, hushed kind of chaos. My mother, recovering her senses, promptly burst into tears. Not for me, but for the catastrophic damage she imagined had been done to Cassandra's marital prospects. Cassandra, for her part, simply fled the library, a choked sob escaping her as she ran. The other guests, to their credit, displayed a remarkable degree of tact. The politician cleared his throat and suddenly recalled an urgent letter he needed to write. The astronomer discovered a fascinating celestial chart in the corner of the room that required her immediate and undivided attention. Mr. Davies, the old professor, simply gave me a slow, deliberate wink before turning to examine a shelf of books. They were affording us a bubble of privacy in the wreckage of my public revelation. Joseph, and it was impossible to think of him as the Duke of Davies anymore, did not take his eyes off me. "Your family," he began, his voice laced with concern. "My family will react as they always do," I said, a strange sense of calm settling over me. "My mother will see it in terms of social advantage and disadvantage. Cassandra, she is hurt because I kept a secret, not because of what the secret was. She will need time." "And you?" he asked, his voice soft. "Are you all right?" It was a question no one had ever really asked me before, not with such genuine, focused concern. "I feel lighter," I confessed, the truth of the words surprising me. The weight of that secret was heavier than I ever realized. To be able to stand here and say, "I am Justicia," it feels like breathing for the first time. He nodded, a look of profound understanding on his face. "I would like to speak with you, alone, when you are ready." I gave a small nod, and he, with a final, lingering look, excused himself to manage the social fallout, to speak to my distraught mother and ensure his other guests were not left entirely to their own devices. I remained in the library, my sanctuary and now the scene of my great unveiling. I ran my hand along the spine of a book, the solid, comforting feel of it grounding me. I was not destroyed, the sky had not fallen. I had spoken my truth, and the world had not ended. Later that evening, after a tense and largely silent dinner that my mother and sister did not attend, Joseph found me on the stone terrace, overlooking the gardens. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. "I owe you an apology," he said, coming to stand beside me at the balustrade. "My methods were manipulative. I put you on display and forced your hand. It was unforgivable." "It was effective," I countered, looking out at the silvered landscape. "And perhaps necessary. I am not sure I would ever have found the courage on my own." I turned to look at him. "Your Grace, Joseph. I must confess I am at a loss. I have spent years writing about the machinations of society, but I have no script for this. What happens now?" "Now," he said, turning to face me fully, "we talk, no games, no tests, just you and me." And so we did. We talked for hours, the cool night air growing colder around us, as the moon arced across the sky. I told him everything. I told him about my father's secret lessons, my mother's relentless focus on Cassandra, the crushing invisibility of my youth. I told him how Justicia was born from a place of frustration and loneliness, how the first scathing chapter I ever wrote was a balm to my wounded soul. I told him about the thrill of seeing my books in print, the terror of hearing people discuss them, the private joy of watching society dance to a tune I had composed. He, in turn, told me of his own intellectual loneliness, of being a duke, surrounded by people who wanted his title, his wealth, his influence, but who had no interest in the contents of his mind. He spoke of his passion for literature and philosophy as the only true refuge in a world of suffocating superficiality. He described reading The Gilded Cage for the first time and feeling a jolt of recognition, a sense of finding a kindred spirit in the anonymous pages. All this time, he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. The person I was searching for was standing right beside me, and I was too blind to see. You were not blind, I corrected him gently. I was an expert at hiding. Then I am grateful I was a persistent seeker, he murmured. As dawn threatened to break, a new understanding had formed between us, a bond forged not in the ballrooms of London, but here, in the quiet honesty of a moonlit terrace. We agreed that the secret of my identity should remain. For now, between us and the few who had been in the library, my public unmasking would come, if it came at all, on my own terms. The next day, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken emotions. My mother refused to leave her room. Cassandra finally emerged, her eyes red and puffy. She found me in the morning room, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you think I was so stupid? Did you laugh at me?" "Never," I said honestly. "Cassandra, I never laughed at you. I hid it from everyone. It was my secret to keep. It had nothing to do with you. But you wrote about us," she said, her eyes filling with tears again. "About Mama, about the girls we grew up with. You put our whole world on paper and made fun of it." "I wrote about the world," I corrected her. "The rules, the expectations, not the people. Or at least I tried not to." I reached out and took her hand. "The life you love, the balls and the dresses, I find it difficult, suffocating. Writing was my way of coping. It was never meant to hurt you." It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. It was the first honest conversation we had had in years. The weekend ended, and we returned to London, our family dynamic irrevocably altered. My mother was cold and distant, treating me with the wary respect one might afford a dangerous, unpredictable animal. But something had shifted in Cassandra. She started watching me, really watching me, as if seeing me for the first time. And Joseph. Joseph was a revelation. Our courtship, no longer a cat-and-mouse game, became a delightful conspiracy. We would meet in dusty bookshops, our fingers brushing as we reached for the same volume. He would send me obscure texts with notes in the margins, sparking silent debates that only we understood. In public, at social events, we played our parts, the brilliant duke and the plain, quiet sister. But now our shared glances across a crowded room were filled with secret meaning, a slight smile, a raised eyebrow, a shared silent observation of some societal absurdity. It was a language all our own, a conversation no one else could hear. He was no longer trying to prove I was Justitia. He was simply enjoying the company of Beatrice. And Beatrice, for the first time in her life, was beginning to believe she was worthy of a duke's attention. Not for the name she had created, but for the woman she had always been. The months following the revelation at Davies Park were a period of quiet, seismic change. Outwardly, little was different. My mother maintained a frosty distance, communicating with me only when absolutely necessary, her disapproval a constant chilly draft in our house. Cassandra was tentative, circling the new reality of our relationship like a cautious deer. She would sometimes ask me questions about my writing, her curiosity warring with a lifetime of ingrained indifference. They were small steps, but they were steps nonetheless. The true transformation was happening within me, and between myself and Joseph. Our secret courtship was the most intellectually alive and emotionally honest experience of my life. We built a world for two, hidden in plain sight. We attended the opera, and while society watched the stage, we would murmur our own critical commentary, a private, witty dialogue that often left us struggling to stifle our laughter. He would invite my family to dinner, a pretense for being able to engage me in a proper conversation, much to my mother's consternation. She could not fathom why the Duke, who was supposedly courting the beautiful Cassandra, spent the bulk of the evening debating political philosophy with the plain Beatrice. "He is merely being polite to your sister," she would insist to a confused Cassandra later. "It is a sign of his excellent breeding." But her words lacked conviction. She saw the way his eyes would find mine across the table, the way a private smile would touch his lips at something I said. She could not understand it, and it infuriated her. During this time, I finished my 4th novel, The Longest Winter. It was my most ambitious work yet, a searing critique of the inheritance laws and their devastating impact on women. It was a better book because of Joseph. He read every draft, not as a patronizing duke, but as a trusted editor and intellectual equal. He would challenge my arguments, strengthen my metaphors, and push me to be bolder, sharper, and more truthful than ever before. To sit with him in his library, my pages spread out between us, debating a sentence or a character's motivation, was a form of intimacy I had never known. It was a meeting of minds so profound it felt more significant than any public courtship. The book was published to a storm of controversy and acclaim. Its subject matter was so scandalous, its critique so pointed, that it became the talk of London. Justitia was no longer just a witty satirist. She was a social revolutionary. The praise was intoxicating, but it was Joseph's opinion I valued most. "You have given a voice to thousands of women who have none," he told me one evening, his voice filled with pride. "This is more than a novel, Beatrice. It is a manifesto." His belief in me, in my work, was a fortress. It shielded me from my mother's disapproval and my own lingering insecurities. With him by my side, I began to feel less like a secret and more like a woman with a purpose. He made me feel that my mind was not a liability to be hidden, but my greatest asset. The final piece of my old life fell away 6 months after the weekend at Davies Park. Joseph formally asked for my hand in marriage. Not in a letter to my mother or in a stuffy formal interview. He asked me one afternoon as we sat on a bench in a quiet city park, watching the autumn leaves fall. "Beatrice Roberts," he said, taking my hand, "you are the most formidable, brilliant, and courageous woman I have ever known. The world knows you as Justitia, but I have had the profound privilege of knowing you as Beatrice. And it is Beatrice I wish to spend my life with. Will you marry me?" My yes was a quiet, certain thing, a word that felt like coming home. The announcement of our engagement sent shockwaves through society that made the fuss over my latest novel look like a ripple in a teacup. The Duke of Davies, the most eligible bachelor in England, was engaged to the plain Miss Roberts, not the diamond Cassandra, but her quiet, bookish older sister. The gossip was vicious and unrelenting. Had she trapped him? Was she secretly an heiress? Was the Duke mad? My mother was mortified, unable to comprehend this bizarre turn of events. She had gotten her duchess, but it was the wrong one. But it was Cassandra's reaction that surprised me most. After the initial shock, she came to my room. She looked at me, at the simple engagement ring on my finger, and for the first time, I saw genuine, unadulterated admiration in her eyes. "He chose you," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "All this time, while I was learning to dance and flirt and be charming, you were becoming someone. He didn't choose the prettiest face, he chose the most interesting mind." She shook her head, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You won the game, Beatrice, and I never even knew we were playing." It was not a game, but I understood what she meant. In the world she knew, the world we were raised in, it was the only way to describe it. We were married a few months later in a small private ceremony. It was not the society wedding of the year my mother had dreamed of for her daughter. It was a quiet, dignified affair for us. And on our wedding day, I gave Joseph my gift. It was the manuscript for my next book. On the title page I had written, "The Unveiling," by Beatrice Davies. The publication of The Unveiling under my own name was the final act. The revelation that the witty, scandalous Justitia was the quiet, plain Miss Roberts, now the Duchess of Davies, was a scandal that dwarfed all others. Some were outraged, feeling they had been duped, but many, particularly women, were inspired. My story became a quiet symbol of hope for all the overlooked, underestimated women in the quiet corners of society. My life with Joseph was everything I never dared to imagine. Our home became a hub for artists, thinkers, and reformers. We were a partnership in every sense of the word. He was the Duke who brought his formidable influence to bear on the causes I wrote about, and I was the Duchess who used her voice to challenge the world to be better. Cassandra eventually married a good-natured country baron who loved her for her sweetness, not her wit, and she was, to everyone's surprise, incredibly happy. My mother, in the end, could not argue with success. Having a celebrated revolutionary author for a daughter was, she decided, almost as good as having a beautiful one, especially when she was also a duchess. Sometimes, late at night, Joseph and I would sit in the great library at Davies Park, the very room where my world had been turned upside down, and we would read together in comfortable silence. He would look up from his book, his gray eyes filled with a love and respect that still, after all these years, took my breath away. and he would smile. In those moments, I would think back to the shy, invisible girl I once was, hiding her true self behind a wall of anonymity. She had been so afraid of being seen, so certain that exposure would mean ruin. She never could have dreamed that being truly, completely seen would not be her destruction, but her salvation. My name is Beatrice Davies, and at 42, I am no longer hiding. My story is a testament to the fact that the brightest lights are sometimes hidden in the deepest shadows, and that the right person will not be distracted by the glitter of the ballroom, but will search for the quiet soul reading in the library. Thank you for listening to my journey. It taught me that your worth is not defined by the role society assigns you, but by the truth you hold within yourself. I'd love to read about your own experiences. Have you ever felt underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments below, because every one of them deserves to be heard. And if my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of resilience and vindication. Share this with anyone who might need a reminder that their quiet strength is a superpower. Thank you for joining me. I hope my story inspires you to let your own light shine, no matter who is or isn't watching.